Welcome back to another episode of The Founder, a show that features entrepreneurs and their early stories of ingenuity, struggle, and perseverance to get their companies off the ground. We do our best to capture the uncensored, uncovered look behind the curtain into what founders really face when getting started. I'm your host, Kallaway. My guest today is a serial entrepreneur that got his start launching Roommate Fit, an eHarmony type service that matched college roommates based on personality to prevent the classic crazy random roommate problem. Although it didn't work out with Roommate Fit, he spent a few years in growth and marketing roles before launching Kettle Fire in 2015. Along the way, he wrote a book called Traction, launched a couple of online courses on growth hacking, acquired a couple of Shopify app-based businesses, and co-founded a second company called Perfect Keto in 2017. At Kettle Fire, this founder and his team are building and scaling the fastest growing bone broth brand in the US. Today, they have over 30 employees and sell a range of products across bone broths and soups. At Perfect Keto, this founder and his team have built a collection of food and supplements to serve as a launch pad for people going keto. The mission across both companies is simple: to produce and sell products that make people healthier. As an added bonus, the team at Kettle Fire have hooked up our listeners with a special offer to kickstart your own journey to living healthier. Enter code THEFOUNDER at checkout for 15% off. As you hear in the interview, there's a lot to love about Kettle Fire products. I personally recommend heating up 8 ounces in a mug with a little sea salt to kickstart your day. And if my endorsement isn't enough to convince you to give it a try, research has shown that bone broth promotes gut and digestive health, supports joint mobility, reduces cellulite and improves skin health, boosts the immune system, and can lead to better sleep. Give it a try and let us know how you like it. This was an inspiring interview that got me excited about changing the narrative around healthy consumption and food trends in the US. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Without further ado, the co-founder of Kettle Fire, Justin Mares. Let's get it. Justin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
Of course. I just want to start off by saying thanks for coming on. The way I like to start these is to have you kind of first provide an anchor point. I know you're a little bit of an enigma in that you have multiple companies running at the same time. So let's kind of talk to Perfect Keto and Kettle Fire. Just provide an anchor point of where each of those businesses are today, just in terms of size, employees, kind of mission, vision, those types of things.
Yeah. So Kettle Fire is about 4.5 years old. We have 30 employees, started in 2015 with our first product was a bone broth product. And that's still kind of our biggest line today. But basically the impetus for starting that and Perfect Keto, which I started in early 2017, was pretty much the same. Like if you look at the landscape of CPG and food in general, on average, food companies today churn out products that if you consume them will make you less healthy rather than more. And so Kettle Fire and Perfect Keto were kind of started to try and address that trend. Kettle Fire by bringing bone broth back into the American diet, Perfect Keto by creating a line of super clean label, keto friendly, low carb, no sugar supplements and food products for people who are interested in making the shift towards what I believe is like a healthier way of eating and living, which is living on like a lower carb, lower processed food kind of diet. And Perfect Keto, I don't think I mentioned one more difference between those. Perfect Keto is 29 people and has been completely bootstrapped. Kettle Fire is 30 people, and we've raised close to $20 million so far.
Okay. I definitely want to get into the distinction as we go. I like to kind of rewind it and start back from the beginning. You're kind of a serial entrepreneur in that you've launched a lot of different things. You have a lot of different interests. So do you want to kind of walk us through your life and background, kind of what you were interested in childhood, and then kind of leading up to working on Perfect Keto and Kettle Fire?
Sure. Yeah. So I basically like grew up in a pretty religious household, oldest 7 kids, was homeschooled for a while, and then went to school starting in 5th grade. And I'd say that I was pretty like normal kid in general. Read a lot, played hockey and lacrosse. But I think where my path really started to diverge maybe was in 2008. Was when I started college. So I went to my freshman year of college, and within this 12-month period, basically, there was that big financial crisis. My dad, who had been like working really hard, he was an accountant. He made a partner. He like did the whole like I'm going to pick a career path stay in my lane and work really hard at it. He did that for 20 plus years, was able to raise a family and provide for a very large family. Um, and still, like, he got laid off in 2008. And so between starting college, realizing that, wow, I thought college was finally going to be the time where I would be challenged and interested intellectually in things and all this, and realizing that wasn't the case, seeing my dad get laid off, and then also being rejected from pretty much every internship that I applied for that summer, I basically found myself in the summer after 2008, kind of thinking like, I was literally working as a janitor at LA Fitness, and kind of realized like, wow, this is a super uninspiring thing that I'm doing right now. All these internships I didn't actually, didn't get. A lot of the people that I'm seeing kind of go down the traditional career path are not necessarily excited about their jobs. Like, talking to a lot of seniors and stuff that I was meeting at college, they were all like really not excited to leave college. And then seeing what my dad kind of went through after putting in 20 years of very hard, focused, like, loyal work. I was just like, man, I don't know that this whole standard career path is something that I want to necessarily do. And so that summer, I started reading different books about entrepreneurship. I actually read The 4 Hour Work Week, which was like a pretty inspirational book for me at the time, and started thinking like, what would it look like for me to potentially start my own business? So that kind of like got me into all this stuff.
Yeah, and so then take us from there. What projects were you working on from that point until you started Kettle and Fire 4.5 years ago?
Yeah, so I had a couple things. One company, the first company I tried to start, you could say did start it, was one. I basically had a terrible freshman roommate, so I started a business called Roommate Fit, which was personality-based roommate matching. So think of it like eHarmony for roommates. And so my junior year, I started, or sophomore year, late sophomore year, I started that company. Started emailing and cold emailing like housing directors at all bunch of different colleges and universities. Started trying to just get a couple customers that would pay us something to have us match their roommates. And so after emailing hundreds of people, I finally got one university, Ohio University, to agree to pilot this program that literally didn't exist. I had to give a pitch in front of the Pitt computer science program and be like, hey, we have a customer. I need someone to help build this. Like, somebody help. And so we ended up matching the next class of Ohio University roommates. Beyond that, we then expanded to 3 other universities the following year. And I joined this program called Alpha Lab, which was sort of a YC for, I went to University of Pittsburgh. And so I was living in Pittsburgh, and this program, Alpha Lab, accepted and funded small startups that were in Pittsburgh that were trying to create jobs in the Pittsburgh area to the tune of 25 to 30 grand. So it was a pretty small amount of funding, but got into that program, which at the time, now I'm like 25, 30 grand, small amount of funding. At the time, being a college student, I was like, I can live forever on 25 to 30
Right.
grand. Like, this is the most money I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I hired 2 people, started working on building out Roommate Fit and turning it into a more real business effectively. From Roommate Fit, I got introduced to this guy who was in the Pittsburgh startup tech community, this guy, Nick Pinkston. He and I kind of hit it off. He had another company called CloudFab that he had started and was kind of starting to scale and get some traction. Roommate Fit, I was kind of I was working on, but I really wanted. I was very aware of how little I knew about startups and entrepreneurship, and so I started talking to Nick and just said, "Hey, is this? I think what you're doing is really cool." Nick at the time was, and still is, probably the smartest person I've ever met. He's just a genius, and so I was like, I want to work with this guy, and so I started helping him out with some of the ops stuff and marketing stuff with CloudFab. That started my junior year, and then my senior year, when I graduated college, I decided to kind of move on with Roommate Fit. It wasn't really working from a scalable business standpoint. I learned a ton, but it's just not a good business. And so I decided to work with Nick Pinkston on CloudFab. And so I joined as sort of a late co-founder and worked on that business until we sold that shortly after my senior year of college. So through doing CloudFab, I met this other guy, Jonathan, also one of the smartest people I've ever met. At the time we met, he was 36, 37, had sold six companies, I think, at that point, and just was a baller and super generous guy, had a great relationship with his wife, had seven kids. It was across the board. He was someone that I was like, I really respect and admire this guy. Like if I'm you at 36, I'll be thrilled. And so I talked to him just about what I was thinking about doing next, kind of was lost, was looking at taking a job at Square, was looking at doing a couple other things. And ultimately Jonathan said, hey, I'm doing this kind of roll up strategy. Do you want to be a part of it? Like, do you want to come in? I'm buying three different companies. We're going to roll them up. We need someone to run growth and sales, part of which meant moving to Las Vegas, which I did. And yeah, so I started working with this guy, built our sales office, support office, ran our marketing. And then about a year after I started working with them, we sold that combination of companies to Rackspace, stayed at Rackspace for a year. And then coming out of that, I co-authored a book called Traction that we launched. Decided, I figured, what do I want to do with this next kind of phase of my life? And that's when I took effectively a year off to kind of explore a couple of different ideas. And one of them was Kettle Fire, which we launched in August of 2015.
Yeah, that's a great summary, and I think helps like put into perspective how you bounced around up until you
A
started.
lot.
I want to shift to Kettle and Fire. So talk us through kind of the genesis for the idea. Where do you even get the idea for shelf stable bone broth, and like how that evolved into kind of a first prototype?
Yeah. So I got the idea basically in 2014. I was doing a lot of CrossFit. I had a bunch of friends that were talking about how they were incorporating bone broth into their diets, how they were using it for joint, skin, gut health. And around that time that I was kind of looking or hearing about it, I went online to buy something or buy some because I was like, I don't want to cook this stuff. It takes forever to cook. And I found that no one was selling a commercially available one that was using high quality ingredients, grass-fed bones, organic bones, all that kind of stuff that I really care about. I've been mostly paleo for 8 or 9 years. And so, more so now than I was when I started, but food quality has been something that I've cared about for quite some time. And so as I kind of went down the bone broth rabbit hole, there was just nothing that kind of met my standards for what I wanted. And around that same time, my brother, he was 18. He was playing soccer his senior year, and he tore during a game effectively everything you can tear in your knee. Like it required surgery. He was bedridden for 7 or 8 weeks. And it was kind of like, hey, Justin, what can I do that can help accelerate this recovery? I'm super unhappy and not, I'm tired of laying in my bed all day. And so I recommended bone broth. And I was in San Francisco at the time, couldn't find a high quality source there. He was in Philadelphia, couldn't find a high quality source. And so we decided to partner up and just were like, hey, let's start this bone broth company together, thinking that at the time I thought it would be a nice family business that would provide maybe some passive income that we could take advantage of while I tried to figure out my next thing. And he took a gap year from college, and he would have some beer money when he went to wherever university he was going to. And so that was kind of the genesis of it. And then 10 months later, our projections were, we thought that this could be, if things went really well after a year, we thought it could be like a 6-figure business. And after we launched it, it took us 10 months to launch, figure out co-packers, figure out all of the stuff that goes into launching a consumer brand, which I'd never done before. And coming out of that, we launched in our first month, I think we did $20,000 or something in revenue. And like the second month we did 40, and we just like kept growing. And we were like, wow, we're really onto something here.
So obviously the healthy food, wholesome food, organic, the whole movement on a coastal level has been happening forever. But in the past couple of years, it's just started to turn the corner. So I'm from Ohio, so I went to Miami University, so close to Pittsburgh.
Nice.
So all of my friends and family there are just coming onto that concept. Where do you think you were in that kind of progression? So from a bone broth perspective, it sounds like you were the first ones in the door, but from the kind of the market of healthy eats, wholesome eats, where do you fit in the landscape, you think?
So it's always hard to say, but I think we're still relatively early. Like I think that there's been a huge movement over the last couple of years towards more natural products, towards organic. Organic and sort of health-oriented consumer products are the fastest growing segment of this is consumer products, and the only growing segment in food right now. Literally, the only thing that's growing is organic and healthier stuff. And so, I think that it was. I think that we were relatively early on the train. Certainly, we're the first in the kind of bone broth space to build a brand there. But yeah, I mean, I think that this trend has a long way to go. I think in the scheme of things, you look at these big CPG companies have been around for over 100 years in every case. Every public CPG has been around for over 100 years, except for I believe Tyson. And these guys are just not making products that are good for people. And you see it in rising obesity rates. You see it in rising healthcare costs. You just see it across the board how what the average person in America eats is fucking their health. I'm hopeful that we're at the start of a revolution, just like a wholesale change in the types of products people put in their bodies and what people consume. Because I think that the status quo of 70% of Americans being overweight, 50% plus being obese, healthcare costs that are, I think it's like 3 times GDP or something, or maybe a third. It might be a third of GDP actually. It just does not feel like a sustainable situation to me. And the only way, or at least in my mind, the easiest way that we can fix that is by changing what people actually get in their diets.
Yeah, I don't even see it as a trend. I see it as a complete shift. Like, I don't think we're coming back to the other side. So I'm curious, when you think about, so pre kind of launch during that 10-month period, a big debate among founders, or at least ones I've talked to, is like, from a socialization perspective, one camp is, let's tell as many people as we possibly can to vet the idea. The other camp is, we think we're onto something cool. Let's keep it hush hush, like do product development in secret and then have some big launch. Where did you fall on that spectrum, and how did you socialize during that development period?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on what you're doing. I think if you're a super technical founder or someone with a really good sense of, maybe in biotech this applies, or maybe if you've figured out a machine learning algorithm that you can apply to a certain problem that no one solved before, that would be a really good time for secrecy. However, I think that in most cases, it's really hard to get anyone to do anything. Like, if you have a really good idea, it will often take even the fastest, most innovative companies years to actually add that to their pipeline. I see that all the time now. Like, if you look, like, I have a friend that started a company called Open Door in San Francisco, where they're basically they're just buying houses sort of on the, it's like instant liquidity for your house. We'll buy it on the spot or within 3 days at a price that we'll underwrite and tell you. So they're sort of doing this, like, it's called iBuying approach to housing. They've been around for 6 years, and it was only in year 5 they've been crushing it. Like, 5 years from zero to being worth, I think, 3 point something billion in their last valuation or last funding round. And it took them 5 years of a very good idea backed by the best people in Silicon Valley, showing incredible traction for Zillow to even try and compete and think about, like, this is an offer that we should probably copy and fast follow. And so I think that that early on, especially, entrepreneurs can really overestimate the risks of having their ideas copied and vastly underestimate the amount of time, grind, like hustle and work that goes into making a successful company. And so for me then, and like for most new entrepreneurs now, I would say the odds that you are going to experience something negative by tipping your hand in terms of what you're doing versus the massive upside of being able to tell everyone in startup land, like, this is the thing I'm solving, this is what I'm doing, this is my angle, and letting them help you. I think that the odds just so outweigh the downsides that I tend to recommend people just talk about what they're doing pretty openly, just because it's going to be a very long journey in most cases, assuming it works.
Yeah, I totally agree. I had one foray into starting a company, and we went kind of stealth mode because we thought, when you first start out, you have no idea. You think everyone's out to get you. But
yeah,
I would say every single venture I ever start in the future will always be, just because not only is it good to generate hype, but the feedback you get is so critical in the iteration process early on. So
yeah, 100%.
So I want to talk about making the first prototype for Kettle Fire. So I've heard on a couple other interviews you did, and kind of when I think about the product, when you have organic ingredients, usually things made from those don't stay fresh long, right? So in order to have a shelf-stable product, there's got to be some kind of innovation or some kind of packaging excellence that goes on behind the scenes. I imagine that was one of your early challenges. Can you talk about figuring that out and kind of what that process looked like?
Yeah. It was really hard. I mean, basically, we had the idea. We had never done anything in food and beverage before, and we we had to do two things. We one had to make a recipe that we thought was better than what was out there, and secondly, we had to find a manufacturing partner that could actually just make the product for us. And so, between those two things, it was really challenging. Like no one specific to our product, the bone broth product, no one effectively was willing to say, "Hey, we're two guys with no experience, no funding, no one that you've ever heard of, and we want to cook a product for and tie up your line, your manufacturing line for 24 plus hours while we like cook our product." And it was just like a really not compelling pitch. Like
Yeah.
people, they're like, "Okay, you've never done this before. You have no money. I have no idea who you are, and you want me to like spend more time cooking your product than any other product I've ever made in my life. Like, why would I do this
Yeah,
again?"
sign me up.
Yeah, exactly. So we called and emailed over 500 different co-packers. Literally all of them said no. And so after that, I think we were pretty down and kind of wondering like, are we actually going to make this product? Are we going to do this? And Nick, my brother, was watching Shark Tank and decided, like, he's 18. He was like, I'm just going to email Mark Cuban and just be like, "Hey, I'm an 18-year-old entrepreneur trying to figure out this thing, trying to launch this company. Do you have any thoughts?" So Nick cold emailed Mark Cuban, and Mark Cuban put him in touch with someone who like runs his food consumer investing team.
Of course.
And that person, yeah, and that person then made an introduction to a manufacturing partner who we then got on the phone with, since the intro came from a manufacturer. They were like, "Yeah, we can try and make this product." And that is the partner that we still work with today to actually make our product. So it's pretty wild.
That's crazy.
Very lucky too.
Yeah, oh, that's so that's so lucky. And I mean, you could have maybe called that partner cold and the same one would have said no. That's
Oh yeah,
it's just because the Mark Cuban open door.
totally.
For people who don't know what bone broth is, so effectively, if you were gonna make a small batch in your house, like how would you make it? You'd walk us through that.
Yeah. So basically, bone broth, if you're going to make it at your house, you'd take bones, you'd cook them down for anywhere between, you know, 10 in the case of chicken bones to 20 plus hours in the case of beef bones. Basically, you would be cooking these things down, and with the goal being that you want to break the bones down so that you get a lot of the collagen, gelatin, and other nutrients that are in these bones into the actual broth itself. So it kind of depends. Like people have all sorts of different recipes and stuff that they like using, and different ways they like to make bone broth. But that's sort of the couple things that are really key are using real bones, using them for long cook times, and incorporating an acid of some sort. We use apple cider vinegar to help the bones break down and release more of the nutrients into the final product.
Yeah. So when you finally identified that manufacturer, when you started working together, did you have a recipe perfected at a small batch level by that time, or did
No.
you co-created that with them?
Yeah, we created it with them just because I'm not very good at cooking. We left it to the professionals and just like did a lot of sampling rounds with our manufacturing partner in general.
So when you launched that first kind of big bang, was it just chicken bone broth, or do you have a couple SKUs? And then as you kind of learned from, it just took off like that, or did you iterate the product a lot kind of early on as you listened to customer feedback?
We definitely did a lot of iterations. So that was the biggest thing that we were focusing on, because we felt like we had to land with a product that we were excited about, that we thought consumers would be excited about, all of that kind of stuff, which was really important.
Yeah. I guess in your mind, when you were going through that pitch to the manufacturers, like, oh, this takes 24 hours, as you start to tell them that, did a light bulb come on in your head like, wait, this is really hard for anyone to do? So this is the reason, like, this is the moat. This is why there aren't a lot of people doing this, because it's so difficult to figure out how to manufacture.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think that there's a tremendous barrier for most people who are trying to start consumer products companies. A lot of the pain comes up front. Like it's very hard to source a manufacturing partner. Formulating is very hard. It's expensive. Like 90% of the pain of, maybe that's too high. Maybe like 70% of the pain of starting a consumer brand is comes in the upfront stage, where you're just like working with partners that are kind of can be slow and like not motivated because you're not a real customer. You're not placing big orders. That it just is can be a challenge.
Yeah. So I want to talk about marketing a little bit. You're, among other things, you're a marketing guru, right? You have a ton of skills in that area. And I like to, in these interviews, I like to go pretty tactical on what people have seen works, what doesn't work. And you're a great person to talk to about this. So talk us through some of the marketing strategies that have worked for you when you do them, right? What are some tips and tricks? What KPIs do you look at? Just walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, they've certainly changed over the years. We've gotten more sophisticated, or I like to think we've gotten more sophisticated. But when we started, we were mainly focused on two channels. We did some like organic SEO type stuff, writing blog posts, trying to rank for things. Kind of did an okay job with that, I would say, not great. But the second channel that we were really focused on was affiliate and influencer marketing. So we did a lot of reaching out to people, particularly in the paleo health and wellness space, and where we were just like, hey, we know that this is a product your audience is going to love. We're going to send you some samples. You're going to love it. And if you talk about it to your audience, whether that's via email, Instagram, whatever, mention us and we'll pay you, some percentage of the revenue that you actually drive our way. And so I think that was sort of like the first thing that really allowed us to scale quickly. I think a lot of brands today will invest very early on in paid acquisition, which can be great. You can scale really quickly, but it certainly is not a marketing channel that gets cheaper over time. If anything, it goes the
Yeah.
opposite way. Whereas investing in organic and affiliates, like a lot more work up front. But if it works for you, ideally you get people who a year later go, oh, I'm buying your product because this person talked about it on a podcast, or I'm buying this product and like I see it on the shelves and I heard about it on this podcast. Like they make the connection and actually get to interact with your brand. And so we invested really heavily in those, partially because for the reasons I just mentioned, and partially because we didn't have the funding to invest really heavily in paid acquisition in kind of the early days.
So for those campaigns, you didn't have to pay them anything up front. It was more just revenue split on the back end, which is all upside for you.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome. When you think about your growth, so you mentioned you guys did 20K the first month, 40K. Was there a rhyme to it, just pure growth, or was there an inflection point ever? And what do you think drove that inflection point, if there was ever a point where you kind of spiked up?
Yeah, I think that there were two things. Like we early on, we launched with a couple people that I had been building relationships with before we actually had a product. And so when we had a product, we had been collecting emails for a couple months, and we had uh, one to two different email lists that we partnered with, where we were just like, hey, we're launching. Can you promote and like share this product around? The second thing that we saw is we very early on partnered with, and we're one of the first, like, I think we at one point we were the most successful product uh, on their platform, but we started working with Thrive Market,
Okay.
which is sort of a better for you Costco type thing. At the time, they had just raised, I think, $100 million and were investing really aggressively in growth. And so they basically saw that we have all this money and we need to acquire all these people. And when we give Kettle and Fire away as a like sign up for Thrive and get a free box of Kettle and Fire, that offer performs better than any other offers that we have out there. And so just doing that, we got in front of a ton of people that were starting to get familiar with the brand. And we started hitting up CrossFit people. We started hitting up paleo people. We started building relationships with literally everyone that we could that was in the health and wellness space, just to talk to them about what we were doing, why the brand is cool, why the product matters, like all that sort of basic blocking and tackling stuff.
Yeah.
At a very early stage. So, which meant that we had a lot of momentum relatively quickly, I would say.
Yeah, I feel like those partnerships, you hear these stories and almost always it seems like, you go into those partnerships optimistic, but just kind of expecting a normal reaction from customers. And then for some reason, it's that one partnership that explodes or acts like you didn't expect it, really drives growth.
Totally.
So when you think about competition, so I know when you guys launched, you were the first of your category. Now I know you go into an organic grocery store or a healthy food section and there's competitors everywhere. How do you see the competitive landscape today? And kind of what still drives differentiation for Kettle and Fire?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that the biggest thing, like if you're launching a consumer brand, if you're moving into a real category, it's really hard to have any sort of like scale advantage or cost advantage, especially as the big guys come into the category. So for us, we have invested a lot in doing things and hitting on kind of marketing and messaging aspects of the brand and the product that our competitors like just can't compete with. And or not that they can't, they won't. And so if I think about things that we talk about a lot are, we use grass-fed bones from animals that are grass-fed, grass-finished, and have access to pasture for our beef bone broth, for example. Our biggest competitor is Campbell's. They have, not only Campbell's on their own, but they also bought another company called Pacific, which is another one of our competitors. And it's just like infeasible that Campbell's, with their public company dictates of like must increase profit per share, earnings per share, would invest in the same quality of like bone sourcing as we have. Like it would massively drive their cost up. It would be so challenging for them to source that many grass-fed, grass-finished bones. And, as part of that, that's not a claim that they can compete with us on. We kind of did a similar thing when we talk about our cook times. Like we believe that when you cook bone broth longer, like you get more collagen and key amino acids in the bone broth. And so we use 20 plus hour cooks for our beef, 10 plus hour for our chicken broth. And so coming out of that, it's like Campbell's has a bunch of production lines. They have millions and millions and millions of cans of soup, of broth, of like all gravies, all these products they have. And for them to tie up 24 hours of manufacturing time boiling one set of bones,
They would never do it.
yeah, like they just have better options. Like they can make 10 batches of different types of soups in that same amount of time. And so we started really, really hammering and reinforcing those things that we think make us truly differentiated, which is kind of, I would say, how we've partially kept some distance between us and the competition. The second thing is like, beyond that, the truth is that in consumer, all you have is your brand and your brand promise. And so we spend a ton of time making sure we're not breaking our brand promise around better for you, super clean label, super high quality ingredients. And then we try and do a lot to build a brand that people are excited by. It's not the every day that people in our age demographic come home and they're like, they feel good or they feel better about themselves for having eaten like a bowl of Campbell's soup. And we want to make Kettle Fire more of a aspirational brand that people can actually resonate with. And I think that gives us some competitive advantage.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. When it comes to like Campbell's, it'd be easier for them to buy than build, I think, in that sense. So that's positions you well.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of goes to the next topic, which is funding. So you mentioned this would be interesting to layer in your insights for Perfect Keto versus Kettle and Fire. So you
Yep.
mentioned you were bootstrapped for Perfect Keto. You raised 20 million for Kettle and Fire. I think there's a lot of value in walking through your path to funding, your approach to funding, kind of lessons learned in those conversations. So you want to kind of take us through your path and thoughts around both, if we can dive into it.
Yeah. So basically the way I approached it is I wanted both businesses, partially because I wasn't sure how big each business would get. I wanted to be pretty conservative and make sure that they could be profitable side projects, because I didn't know that they'd be anything more than that, right? So with Kettle and Fire, when we decided to launch, it's me and my brother, we're talking about doing this as a side project. I was still thinking about doing other stuff. He was thinking about going back to college. And because of that, and we didn't come from a lot of money. We just didn't have the option to say like, this is something that we're willing to lose millions of dollars on for a couple of years until we turn the corner on profitability. Like we had to be profitable right out the gate. And so that was kind of our goal. So we launched in August 2015. We raised no money until I guess it was September of 2017. So ran the company almost 2 years, made a profit the first year, made a profit the second year. And before we started, before we raised money. And then we raised a very small amount. We raised about 900K and did it from kind of like influencer angel type people, which was my first time ever raising money. And, I think that if I could do it again, like somewhat questionable if I would do it again, but because we basically were still in the stage of like, how big can this get? I think raising money will allow us to turn on the gas and like do some things that we want to do. So it probably makes sense for at least a little bit. So we did that. And then, we raised that in 2016. So September of 2016. So we're a little over a year old. And then fast forward 2 years, 2016, we were profitable. 2017, we broke even. 2018, we were it was pretty clear that there was something more to this business than we had thought. Like we had the sort of like halo or ceiling that a lot of consumer brands don't get over is like the 10 million ceiling. And we had gotten there or on path. We had gotten there in like 3 years, basically, which is pretty remarkable for a brand with people that didn't have CPG background. It was like effectively bootstrapped, like raising less than $1 million. We were still profitable. We had a huge contingent of online sales. We had almost no retail distribution. We had gotten nationwide Whole Foods in early 2017, and like the numbers were amazing in terms of our sales at Whole Foods. So it was just like it was clear, or I felt like all signs were pointing towards there's a bigger opportunity here than we'd initially thought. And so in early 2018, we started thinking about, if we think there's a bigger opportunity here, if we think this market is bigger, if we think that there's all these like ways that we can improve this product, that we can like get it to a more accessible price point, we can invest internally in some stuff. Why would we not do that? Like, why would we keep this business smaller when there's plenty of capital out there that is looking to invest in businesses like ours, and we actually could use the money? Like, we have very no-brainer places that we could deploy that capital in a way that would be really accretive. And so in I guess it was like September of 2018, we closed a funding round for 16 million with Kallaway Ventures, which is like a well-known VC in the kind of consumer brand world, which basically we decided like we want to have enough money on our balance sheet to invest in some sort of operational supply chain things. At the time, the team was 11 people. No one practically had CPG experience. We knew that we needed people with experience. We had no one in finance. We had one person in sales. We had one person in customer support. We had a couple of people in marketing. And basically, we were just like, we don't know what it looks like to have to build a company in CPG, especially in the retail space. And so we wanted the money so that we could hire ahead and get people that were experienced, that were thoughtful, and that would help us kind of chart our path into retail over the next couple of years. And so that's what we did. So we hired, we raised the money, we quickly doubled the team, and man, doing that was by far one of the best decisions I think we've made at the company. I think that I didn't appreciate until we hired really expert people how much there was about my business that I just didn't know and understand. And so getting the right people on board was far and away the best thing that we could have done. And I don't know that we could have done it without raising money.
Yeah. And I have kind of a few questions around hiring, so we can cut to those now. Other than kind of functional expertise, which is, as you said, critical, what are some of those key characteristics that you looked for in these people you brought on? Because I feel like there's a right when you bring an expert in a field on, and the incumbents who are doing really well might not have that expertise, there's a chance there could be some, like, not hostility, but definitely some feelings of, I don't want to say entitlement, but those type of negative feelings with experts coming on, right? So how do you maintain that kind of positive relationship with those people? What characteristics did you look for, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did a couple things. Like when we raised, there's one guy in Austin who's on our board, this guy Clayton Christopher, who has had 2 extremely successful exits in the consumer space. And so we had him. The way we basically thought about it is like, we now have this money in the bank. We have a pretty clear roadmap of where we need to go. Let's focus on, let's say like, okay, 2018, over the next 12 months, when we closed the round, we said over the next 12 months, we want to build out our sales, operations, and finance teams. And so rather than like trying to pull together a bunch of people where I'll have to evaluate them, none of which, I've never hired a CFO, I've never hired a controller, I've never like done a lot of these things. So rather than do that and try and figure out how to hire each one of these people, I instead decided to like try and find really, really good executives at the company, or good executives in general, that we could bring into the company, where we basically hire like Brian, our current CFO, and said, Brian, you're our guy, build out your team. Did the same thing in sales, did the same thing in operations. And so we basically like went from having a hiring problem of like, who do we hire for 20 different roles, to who are the 3 to 4 people that we need to hire to build out our executive team, and then just let them focus on hiring and building the rest of it. And so that was really key. We had our board member Clayton. He interviewed all of our top exec hires. He helped us think through what we should look for, who we need to hire at this stage. He was really like tremendously helpful during a very, very key time in the company's history, where honestly, like, the tough thing about making executive hires is like you just can't make that many mistakes. Like, you're going to make mistakes for sure. We've hired a COO, parted ways. We've definitely had executive mistakes that we made, but you just have to minimize them. And had we made like a wrong CFO hire, it may have killed us. Had we hired the wrong SVP of sales, like, maybe we wouldn't be here. There's a lot of ways that executive hires can go wrong. And so we wanted to spend a lot of time having me evaluate, and then Clayton and some other advisors on the company evaluate just like how good some of these key execs were.
So kind of dialing in on that, who would you say is your most underrated or timely hire? So someone that filled a functional gap that you desperately needed to fill, or you brought someone on at some certain time and then they ended up kind of succeeding in some other area that you like were really impressed with over time.
Yeah, so this kind of changed at every stage of the company. Like, we got really lucky when we first started the company. We were bootstrapped and had not raised any money yet, and we're 100% direct to consumer. Two of our first 3 hires were people that were cheap. They were like around my age. They were super hungry, willing to learn, and they wanted to get into growth marketing and become world class at growing and scaling a consumer brand. And so those were our first 2 hires, and they are amazing. Like, we have a world class growth marketing team, mainly because of these 2 guys that have built out just an unbelievable team under them. And they were 2 of the first 3 hires of the company. So that was an incredible one. And like, all of our direct consumer traction led to our eventual success in retail, which led to funding. Like, that was sort of one of them. We seem to have had hires land at times exactly when we needed them. Our sales guy, Pat, we hired in 2017, I think, where basically we were just starting to get into retail and we didn't know what we were doing at all. And so we hired this guy, Pat, and we're like, hey, do you want to be like our retail guy? And, Pat from day one came in, got it, like, managed the Whole Foods relationship, which was our only retailer, then took us into a bunch of other retailers, and was literally the only retail hire that we had until roughly when we closed our funding round for about 2 years. And so at one point, he's like a one-man show managing a $6 million retail line of business. Like, it was just crazy that he did that, managed it, and could handle it himself. And then at another point after we raised, like, we were really close to, because I didn't know what I was doing, we were really close to running out of money. I didn't, or we just like weren't accounting for doing projections right. Our financial model was off, like all this kind of stuff. And so our CFO hire that we landed was unbelievably important, to an extent that I didn't appreciate until I started working with him. Like, now I think financial hires are among the most important hires that you can make, especially early in a company's life cycle. But I just didn't appreciate that at the time. So we didn't make it. And then once he came on, it totally blew my mind and changed the way I think about it.
Yeah. One more question, then we can shift to kind of this more rapid fire round. So it's about scale. If you were to kind of manifest what you think the next 5 to 10 years looks like for Kettle and Fire, what's the future vision? Where do you hope the company is?
Yeah. So I think the broad opportunity for Kettle and Fire is effectively to change the way that, to basically like bring the health benefits of bone broth back into the American diet, and to create a category leading brand that kind of stands for super clean label, and this like concept of nose to tail eating. We're taking a product that people historically throw away, like bones of cattle, and turning it into a source of nutrition and a food product for many people. And so if I like zoom out a couple of years, I think that there's a ton of waste. There's a ton of products that are created that are just not good for people. And I think that we have the opportunity to create a set of products that reduce that waste and give people a bunch of the health benefits that they can get from things that people haven't like isn't in the American diet today, where it was 30, 40 years ago. Things like organ meats, bone marrow, bone broth, and the like. I think there's a whole slew of products we can build out that sort of help people get healthier and also do good for the environment.
Awesome. Okay, so more of a rapid fire round. First one's around kind of mentor advice. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever gotten from a mentor along the way across your entire kind of entrepreneurial journey?
I think that the best advice is always personal, and it's always relates to where you are at a given point in time. And so for me, I think what was most impactful is I had a mentor kind of early on who was saying that, if I had a lot of anxiety and stress around like, am I doing enough? Will I be enough? Am I going to be successful? Am I not? Is this going to be a thing that actually works? Am I going to have to go get a job that I hate and eventually just, have a life that I'm not excited by? And he kind of just said, if like look at all the things that you're doing, like you're reading all the time, you're networking, you're meeting people, you're trying to pick up skills, you're spending your free time teaching yourself, you're spending your free time launching side projects, like you're just like doing a lot of things. And to the extent that you are humble, keep doing a lot of stuff, keep trying to learn and improve yourself, keep building a network. There's like almost no doubt that 10 years from now, you're going to be successful doing something. And I think that I wish I'd internalized that a little bit better because I think that I'm like really proud and happy with where we've gotten to and where the businesses are and where I am in my career. But at the same time, I could have enjoyed the ride a lot more if I was more like trust the process, don't get down on yourself, don't get super stressed. And I think that I spent a lot of like really key years where I was like grinding really hard and working really hard. That was great and fun, but I spent a lot of it kind of being miserable and feeling like I wasn't doing enough, which was maybe not being miserable. That might be too strong, but yeah, I wish I just like trusted the process and trusted that by doing, as my mentor said, like focusing on doing things, getting better, improving, and building capability, like that I'll just end up in a better place.
Yeah. Can you recall a story that or experience that was like super frustrating along the way? Obviously, this may have been one of the things that caused that anxiety and stress, but what was that moment for you?
Yeah, I mean, trying to find a co-packer to make a product that I had already tested online, I knew was going to sell. I felt like people actually wanted, and just being utterly unable and failing over and over and over again to find someone that would actually manufacture a product for us. Like that was incredibly frustrating. I mean, we've had issues with past employees. We've had issues with one board member. Like there've been a lot of frustrating things that have happened in the business that have made me be like, man, I just want to run this business. Like this is my life. This is what I'm excited about doing. Like I don't like dealing with unnecessary amounts. What feels to me is like unnecessary amounts of crap, but like at the same time, it's kind of the job sometimes. And I'm really enjoy and proud of what we do 95% of the time. And so 5% of the time I'm frustrated and unhappy. Like that's still better to me than working at American Eagle in their like corporate department, which was literally what I was looking at doing when I graduated college. So I feel very grateful that I don't do that.
Yeah, it's a good trade-off for sure. I feel like a lot of founders have this like edge, like to execute. They execute at a really high level. That's why they're successful founders. What do you think gives you that edge that makes you better at executing than most people?
I don't know that it's an edge as much as it's like I've gotten a lot of reps in. Like I don't know, like even when I was 20, I've just like taken a lot of shots on goal where, started Remate Fit and then saw this other opportunity for Cloud Fab. And then I was like, okay, I'm also going to work with this other guy, Nick. I'm going to see how he does stuff. And then coming out of that, started working with Jonathan. Then while I was doing stuff for Exceptional, like started working on Traction Book, and just there were a lot of things that I was doing that meant that at all times I was kind of like trying to push the limits or learn something or like test an idea, test a side project, get something off the ground. And I think that in a way, I mean, I wouldn't say that it hasn't worked because I think it has for me, but I think that and it's been a source of strength. I think at the same time, though, there's other ways where I've seen people achieve a absolutely tremendous amount by going incredibly deep on one thing, becoming like a craftsman, becoming best in the world at X. That's certainly not the approach that I've taken. Instead, I've sort of optimized for trying to get really good at quickly launching things and just sort of like doing a lot of stuff and hoping that some of it will stick.
Yeah.
It's not a great answer, but
No, that
um,
that's fair. So another interesting thing is around kind of like trend sensing. So I think other than the natural foods bone broth space, I know you read a ton and you're of course aware a lot of things going on. Are there any market trends that you see that are emerging maybe 3 to 5 years out that make you excited, either as a potential consumer or I don't know if you angel invest on the side or potentially another side project?
Mhm.
Any of those that pop into your mind?
I think that like the most valuable companies are the ones that um, solve the biggest problems. And so for me, I think that I'm less interested in like what startups are kind of interesting or likely to do well, and much more interested in like what companies are likely to solve big problems. And so for me, like I'm pretty bullish on the next decade of starting consumer brands that in the health and wellness space. Like I'm pretty bullish on anything that can materially drive down the cost of healthcare. I'm pretty bullish on things that provide decentralized alternatives to large centralized organizations, government agencies, whatever it is that are doing like a bad job right now. And so I'd say that, and then there's obviously like technological or technology adoption curves that are getting pretty interesting. Like things in VR, AR are getting pretty interesting. Crypto is probably within like 5 years of having 10 companies worth over $1 billion, maybe like 100 companies worth over $1 billion. I don't know. You see like the cost curve of genetic sequencing coming down at a faster rate than Moore's law, which will enable a bunch of interesting stuff. You see what like a virus with I think like 10 times more deadly than the flu has shut down every major economy in the world. So you're like, okay, so biotech is going to be a massive thing because like there's no possible way that all the economies in the world can shut down every time a more deadly flu comes along. And I'm not like knocking it. I think obviously coronavirus is a tremendous deal, but it's also like not it's not possible to me that the steady state for the next decade is every time a novel virus gets out into the world, the entire world shuts down for an indefinite period. Um, and so there's just certain things like that that I get really bullish on. And I think like someone is going to play a big role in solving those things. I'm also generally like bullish on what I'm seeing as a trend towards smaller companies that are solving a very niche problem that are not venture backable, but that are kind of like meant to build an amazing lifestyle for the founder. Like I think that we're going to see a lot more 1 to 10 person teams that are building companies that do somewhere in the neighborhood of 500K to $10 million a year, and that will be sort of like a trend that'll go forward. David Perel has an article about this called like the new American dream, which is this idea of being like a 1 to 3 man team that does $1 million a year pretty consistently. Generally, he talks about software, but I think that trend is like growing and will probably be here to stay. Just because I think it's like it satisfies a lot of what people want, which is freedom of time, financial freedom, all that stuff, which I think is more attainable now than it ever has been.
Yeah, totally agree with that. So we talked about a lot things that, were difficult early on, finding the co-packer, frustrating moments. Today, what's your biggest challenge? What kind of keeps you up at night as you look forward? Obviously, coronavirus is a big one, but beyond that, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's almost all people stuff, I would say. It's sort of the things that keep me up at night right now are things that are big questions. So, questions around strategy for both of the companies. There's strategy is one of those things where it's like my job to decide what are we going to work on and what are we not going to work on over the next like 12 to 18 months. And to that extent, and unfortunately, there's not really a right answer in either of those cases. And so I'm just taking an educated guess, and I can do my best to make that guess a good one, but still a guess. And so those sorts of like questions without an answer definitely are ones that keep me up at night. And then the rest is just personnel stuff. There's like running a business, I feel like is always, you're basically just like fighting entropy. Like businesses, if left to themselves, will just fall apart immediately. Maybe not immediately, but they like tend to just disintegrate and not do very well. And so I think that something I think a lot about is a large part of my job, no matter what, is just going to be making sure that, okay, we say we're going to hit this goal. Is Jeff executing on the right thing? Is Josh making sure that X, Y, and Z trinket is being made? Is Julia doing all the customer support stuff right? Just making sure that that's operating well is another really key thing.
Yeah. A lot of people I've talked to on this show, a lot of founders, everyone walks away saying like it's an amazing experience, but it's so hard. It's so difficult. How would you sum that up? Why is being a founder so difficult?
I think there's a lot of reasons, but I think that there's not really a playbook for it. It's one of those things that are difficult are generally ones that are just slightly beyond your scope of experience and that are also really, I would say, like things that are hard are basically things that you don't know how to do and that it's really hard to understand how do I do this thing? You know what I mean? Like learning to figure skate or something is hard if you haven't done it before, and it's even harder if you don't have a coach, and it's even harder if no one has ever figure skated in the history of humanity. And so for a lot of things, like for a lot of founders, like not only is this thing they're doing the first time they've ever tried to do that thing, but they don't know anyone else that has also done something in that space. And in some cases, like there's no one that's ever tried to do the exact same thing that they're doing. And so, and then and that's just like starting a company. And then you layer on like personnel issues, funding issues, cap table issues. Like there's just so many ways, we kind of talked about fighting entropy. There's just so many ways that businesses and startups collapse and go wrong, that it's almost amazing that any of these things survive past even a couple of years. And so I think like those all make things difficult. And then generally like the act of creation is just a really difficult one. And I think that that's great to the extent that it means it's really hard for other people to do stuff to compete, like to do the similar thing to compete with you. But I also think it's like, of course, challenging because to some extent you're doing something that hasn't been done, and trying to put your own unique spin of and like bring forth something that you think needs to exist in the world. And that's just the act of creation is always really, really hard.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Any books, newsletters, podcasts, follows on social that you'd recommend for people who are either aspiring founders or just interested in the topic of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two types of people that I would kind of bucket. One, I think, is the question of like, I have an idea that's relatively unique, or I have like some zone of expertise or an understanding of a space, and like I have a pretty clear idea of like what I want to start in the space. I think those people need to learn like how do I build a business and how do I maximize my chances of success building a business. So for those people, I would say reading books like The Lean Startup can be really helpful. Watching Y Combinator has this lecture series called How to Start a Startup that I would totally recommend. Instead of reading like 10 books on entrepreneurship, I would probably just watch that lecture series 5 different times. And then there's another book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany that I found very helpful back in the day, but I have not revisited it since. I think those are probably like the core books I would read to think about how do I build a business that from like and then the High Growth Handbook, I would say are sort of like the resources I would check. For everyone else, I think like for your average person, it's actually way less important to understand how to build a business or to like be interested or read about startups. And I think it's way more important to develop conviction around a certain idea, problem space, or problem that you decide at some point you want to solve. Like, I think if I could do it all over again, I spent a bunch of my time listening to like Mixergy interviews and listening to This Week in Startups, and like all these founders talk about being founders, and reading Hacker News talking about founders, like blog articles, and just being in the whole like startup ecosystem, reading ecosystem. And I think broadly it wasn't that helpful for me relative to had I just spent all that time like really developing an opinion and a strong set of convictions around a problem space, or like even an area that I wanted to work on. I think that like the how do I run a company stuff is way, way easier to figure out. And it's better even to figure it out as you're running something because you have very specific problems to solve. Whereas what I see a lot of people do is they like decide they want to become a founder and then try and find an idea, which that can work,
Yeah,
but
rarely
it's
does.
really hard. Yeah, I mean, it's just really hard. Like it's really hard because we already talked about starting a company is difficult. Think if you're like trying to quickly follow, or you're like, oh, I see social media is blowing up, and Groupon's blowing up. So like, let's make a social deals platform or something like that. Like that person who thinks about startups that way is not going to have the conviction to hang in there, keep working on this problem when the going gets rough. And so I think you actually want to try and do something and find the thing that you are high conviction about, because that means that you'll stick through it and your startup is more likely to be successful. But I could be wrong. That's just how I think about it right now.
No, I agree with you on that. Kind of going, I want to be a founder and searching for an idea rarely works. Okay, so final two questions. We ask every guest on the show these. First one is the startup manifesto. So if you had to write a startup manifesto with 5 of the most important key lessons or pitfalls to avoid when starting out, what would they be?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I would focus on, I mean, they all sound kind of trite, right? Like you've probably read all of them or heard of all of them, but they're also very true, which is why people repeat them a lot. But I would say one is like only work with people that you think are high integrity and you want to spend time with. I made that mistake of, our first funding round for Kettle and Fire. We had someone that I was like, I think this person will be helpful, though I don't necessarily respect or admire them. But I think they'll be helpful. So like we should raise money from them. That ended up being a tremendous mistake. The second thing is like hire people that you think are really smart and get the job done. Like I especially in senior roles, I can't stress enough how important it is to hire people that you respect, enjoy working with, and that have done what you want them to do before. I think the third thing is Keith Boy has this really good kind of delineation between hiring for value protecting roles and value creation roles. I think that understanding that difference of like, am I hiring someone to protect what we already have, basically like finance, legal, operations, like make sure things are kind of running as we want them to, or am I hiring someone to create value, which would be more like marketing, sales, product, some of those kinds of people. I think understanding that really helps you filter someone when you get to interview them and review their background. I think those are 3. The fourth one I would say is I think it's really important to build conviction in something and to do something that you feel strongly about. I mean, this shit is just tough. And like, if you do it well, if you succeed, then you're going to be surrounded by people in your industry, people who are starting other companies in your problem space all the time. I think this is something I underappreciated at Exceptional is just like, okay, if I am successful at running growth for this like suite of software tools, I'm going to be spending all of my time around software developers and people who are like marketing the software developers. So if that's not exciting to me, I shouldn't like win at this game that I'm playing. And then once I've won, be like, oh shit, this is actually not a life that I'm excited about, because this is not like, it's not what I want to do. It's not space I care about. It's not full of people that I want to be around. So I think that was an important one. And then the last thing too, I would think is like at every turn possible, I would say focus on like things that are really material, like relationships, money in the bank, getting good at a skill, developing a craft, building a brand, like talking to your customers. Focus on things like that way more than things that make you kind of feel good or feel successful. Like don't fall into like PR traps. Don't fall into like being a social media influencer. Don't spend a bunch of your day on Twitter. Like there's all these things that I think people can like hit a certain amount of success and then start to fall into. And I think that that's a really important thing to watch out for. Like Ryan Hoover started Product Hunt and he had this tweet that I always think about, which is like coffee meetings kill startups, which I think is so true. Like the better you do, the more people are going to want to have coffee with you. And yet the more coffees you do, the less time you're spending working on your art, your craft, your startup, which means it's more likely you're going to fail. And I totally believe that. And I see that more and more true as I get older.
Yeah, that's a great list. Last question is the nomination. So this has been a really successful way for the show to grow, and everyone who's come on so far has made a great nomination. So it's your turn to nominate another founder that is a friend, colleague, or mentor of yours that you'd like to see on the show.
I think Ryan Culp might be an interesting one. So he does FOMO with me.
Okay, cool. So I want to quickly just acknowledge you, acknowledge all my guests for something kind of interesting that's inspiring from the conversation. I think for you, it's kind of your curiosity. It sounds like you've not only been running at so many different things, but always had multiple things in the hopper, always trying to learn new skills, always trying to explore new industries. And I think that's really inspiring. And I'm excited to kind of stay along for the ride for Perfect Keto, Kettle and Fire, and wish you all the best.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Of course. Justin Mayers, founder of Kettle Fire. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, man.
Thank you for listening to that episode with Justin Mayers of Kettle Fire. If you liked what you heard and want to support the show, there's a couple quick things you could do that would really help us out. 1, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you go on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a 5-star rating and a couple sentence positive review on why the show inspired you. These ratings and reviews are super important, and they signal to Apple that they should put our show in front of other people that might like it. 2, follow us on social, mainly Instagram and Twitter, at Founder Podcast. Each week we put out teasers, audio clips, and important quotes from the episode of the week. And lastly, we're pumped to announce that our website for the show is now live. Go to www.thefounderpod.com as a mission control for the show. We have a page on there called Special Offers where we link up discount codes from our founders' companies, as well as all the books and resources that have been recommended across our episodes. I hope you enjoyed that episode and are looking forward to the next one. Until then, I'm Kallaway, and this is The Founder.